Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I have a little bit of a cough, so I apologize in advance if I'm coughing through in the middle of the presentation. I'm Srikrupa Srivatsan. I'm Senior Product Marketing Manager at Infoblox. How many of you have heard of Infoblox and what we do? Okay, good, a few people. I have with me Ryan. He's our Superstar SE. So he can talk to you after the presentation as well if you have any technical questions. We also have a booth number 214 at the show floor. If you haven't already been there, please go ahead and visit our booth. We are, you will be entered to win a Bluetooth speaker after the show. So if you haven't stopped by at our booth, please do so. Today's presentation is going to be about securing sensitive information or securing sensitive data inside your network. But it's not your traditional way of securing data. It's something that most organizations don't think about, and it's a gap in most agencies, most companies do not protect this particular threat vector. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how exploiters are taking advantage of that security gap. So when you think about security, what comes to mind for most of you guys? Right. Yeah, data. Sorry? Yeah, anti-hacking. Firewalls. You might be thinking of firewalls to prevent malware. You might be thinking of antivirus. You might be thinking of endpoint security. DNS doesn't probably come into your thinking process when you think about security, right? DNS is typically something that the network team manages. They run, they deploy it. It's to keep your applications. It's to connect users to applications. It's to connect users to websites. But when you think about security, you don't think about DNS. So what I want to talk to you about today is how attackers are actually using this to their advantage and taking advantage of this DNS loophole to not just attack your infrastructure, but also to get to your sensitive data. Right? So we'll take a look at some of the different ways they do that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the importance of DNS data and network context to improve security in your agency, in your organization. So you might have heard about ransomware. We keep hearing about it now and then. In the first 3 months of this year also, ransomware made the news frequently. Especially government agencies have been hit big time, as well, as you can see from this recent report. There have been compromises of personal files, 21.5 million to be exact. This includes all the different confidential information that government agencies might have, right? Health history, arrest records, fingerprint data, any other secrets that the agencies might have, the attackers are after. So there's been a lot of talk about ransomware. And if for those who are not aware, ransomware is a specific type of malware that actually gets into your network, gets into the endpoint, into your laptop or iPad, and it'll encrypt all the data on the laptop, and it'll ask you to pay a ransom to get your data back, right? So and people have been paying ransom to get the data back because they didn't know what else to do, right? Yeah. So it's pretty serious, and the irony is you can probably not even read how many security vendors there are out there providing solutions for securing your infrastructure, for securing your data. And still, we keep hearing about these incidents all the time in the news about ransomware and other types of malware and data breaches. So as you can see, there are different technologies offering different types of protection, but still, it's not enough. And it's perplexing why it's not enough. And one of the reasons that we think it's not enough is because when you implement all these different security technologies in your network, you think you're getting this really cool looking nice car, which is fully integrated, it's going to perform really well, it's going to protect you. But what you're actually getting is a whole bunch of parts, right? You're getting different components of security, which are siloed, which don't talk to each other, there's no context. So what the security operations team and the SOC centers, what they're getting is a whole bunch of alerts, and they're not able to decide, which threats are real, which threats are not, which threats are significant, which threats are not, and basically prioritizing those events becomes a very big challenge. They're already short-staffed in terms of resources. They don't have enough visibility into where the threats are in the network, and there's a lot of manual processes involved in mitigation. So one of the reasons could be that companies and agencies need a more integrated security strategy where they can get a lot of visibility and get a lot of network context so they can prioritize which events to go after. So I talked about the silos, right? The goals of the networking team are different from the security team. We've seen this when we talk to our customers as well. Networking team cares about high availability of the infrastructure, switches, routers, their DNS servers, etc. They care about monitoring everything that's happening on their network. But the goal of the security team is slightly different. It's more about risk mitigation. It's more about keeping the data secure, right? And they don't necessarily often talk to each other, and that could be another reason why organizations are not as secure as they can be. And getting those two teams to really work closely together is important. And when you think about DNS, right, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, DNS is actually being used more increasingly in recent times to attack organizations and to take sensitive data. There are three different kind of ways that attackers use DNS for malicious purposes. First one is just bringing it down, bringing the DNS server down, using DNS amplification, reflection attacks that can cause poor performance, poor service, and actually even lack of service availability. The second one is malware, and there's in the next slide you'll see from the Cisco security report, a lot of the malware uses DNS as a first point of communication to call its home command and control site. And most malware uses DNS. And if there's a security layer on top of DNS that can detect this malicious communications, you can actually reduce the time it takes to identify malware before it causes further damage. The third one is data exfiltration, and this is something we focus on in this presentation, is protecting the back or closing the back door to your sensitive data, and that back door is DNS, right? So we've seen cases where infected endpoints or malicious insiders actually establish DNS tunnels and exfiltrate data out, or they actually embed data directly on the DNS queries and they exfiltrate data out. So we'll see a couple of different techniques there as well. But as I mentioned, Cisco's security report, latest 2016 security report, says that 90% or more of malware uses DNS. And they use it once they get inside the network. They breach the perimeter firewall, whatever your IDS, IPS devices. They try to call home to download further malicious software, right? And when they call home, they do it using DNS lookup. So what happens is most firewalls do not protect against malicious communications over DNS. They leave port 53 open for the DNS traffic, and they don't know much of inspection, right? And this could lead to a lot of activities, including data breaches and things like that. So it's a big problem in enterprises, and it's a big problem in organizations today. And as I mentioned, once it enters the perimeter, it tries to call home through the DNS server, and then it downloads malicious software, and then it goes ahead and does the data exfiltration again through DNS. So this is a typical stage that malware goes through in the whole life cycle or the kill chain, and DNS is a big part of that. So when you talk about sensitive data or getting access to your data, DNS tunneling attacks or DNS tunneling toolkits are readily available. Things like Iodine, DNS Cat, those are readily available off-the-shelf tunneling toolkits that anybody can download and start using, either to exfiltrate data or to bypass Wi-Fi firewalls, all of this on the service provider side. But we've seen a lot of cases of that. We've seen a recent survey, 46% of large companies have experienced DNS-based data exfiltration. We don't have to tell you what's the cost of a data breach. It's not only the cost, but it's also the loss of confidential information that's actually going to cause more damage as well. So these are some customer examples. These are customers that we've helped recently in protecting their data through the DNS capabilities. So there was a large global US defense agency. This was an interesting story because they had about 40 million malicious queries going out every week to known bad destinations. So they were able to see the malicious queries going out, but they could not tell exactly where the queries were coming from, right? Which endpoints were infected, which devices were infected. And this is 40 million is such a large number, it's hard to really get that visibility. And with Infoblox technology, what they were able to do is accurately pinpoint up to the endpoint, up to the laptop, or up to the device that is actually making these malicious communications. They were able to accurately detect and pinpoint those infected devices. So then the security teams could go and clean up the laptop or the device. So it was a really big win for them and for us, and they were able to really get rid of this malicious activity going on their networks. Major U.S. federal agency, again, they wanted to talk. They were really concerned about leakage of sensitive data. And they wanted to plug any vulnerabilities in their infrastructure. They've realized that DNS was a gap that was unprotected for them, so they used Infoblox to do that. And then a couple of more agencies, a bank failed an audit because they realized that the data was not sufficiently protected over DNS. So they had firewalls, they had all the other things in place, but they still failed the audit because of lack of protection for data. So I kind of gave you an overview of the threat landscape, but when you look at DNS, right? So I mentioned some standard tunneling toolkits like Iodine or DNS Cat and some of the stuff mentioned down there. So basically, they use it. The infected and the client. They have a client-side tunnel program that runs these tunneling toolkits. There's a server on the internet that's on the other side. That's the other side of the tunnel. And they establish this tunnel, and then obviously they can insert malware, they can exfiltrate data right out of that tunnel without any detection. And we've seen a lot of cases of this, and this is very easy to do. You can just download it off the internet, those toolkits, and just start doing it, right? This is the second type of data exfiltration over DNS queries is slightly more sophisticated. So in this case, what happens is these are not standard tunneling toolkits, so nobody knows how these techniques work unless you're actively monitoring the queries and doing some analysis on the queries. So in this case, we've seen this in one of our customers where the infected endpoint was actually, had access to this sensitive information, and it was breaking that information up into chunks, encrypting it, and then adding it, prepending the DNS queries with that information, and then sending the DNS queries out to the destination. And we just put it like thief.com, but the destination receives these queries, pieces it back together, decrypts it, and then it has all the sensitive information at its fingertips. So this is something we saw in one of our customer sites, and these are zero-day techniques, right? Attackers use different methods. It's not standard tunneling toolkits. So these are harder to detect. And they also use spoofed addresses, so it's hard to find out where they're coming from. So what are the bad guys after? I think we all know this. They obviously want personally identifiable information, your social security numbers, your credit cards. They want, they also want intellectual property, especially if they're competitors. They can sell it in the underground market for a pretty neat profit, right? Any of that information. It could be for hacktivism, espionage, or to make a financial profit. So, this is pretty common, and we've seen a lot of cases of data exfiltration for these particular reasons. So we talked about the problem landscape, but let's look at how you can protect yourself from some of these techniques, right? How you can stay more secure using DNS. So obviously, Infoblox is a DNS, DHCP, and IP address management provider, and we have a lot of competency around the DNS technology. And the way we look at security is how can we improve an agency's security or an organization's security using stuff you already have, which is your DNS. Everybody has DNS in their networks, DDI infrastructure. So using stuff you already have and bolstering security is where we come from, and that's the angle we take, right? And there are three different ways that we can protect your infrastructure and your data. First one is the one in the blue box, which is signature-based detection for any DNS-based DDoS attacks. right? So we have technologies that have signature rules built into them. So when DNS queries are coming in, we can detect if it's part of a DDoS attack, and then we can immediately drop those queries, and the DNS server will continue to respond only to the legitimate queries. So you still have that service availability, even if you're under a DDoS attack, right? We can also detect the standard DNS tunneling toolkits using signatures like Iodine and DNS Cat and those type of toolkits. We can very easily detect it using the signature-based method. The second one on the green box is reputation-based detection. So this is where we get threat intelligence. Recently, we acquired a threat intelligence company called IID. So we now have our own threat research team. We now have our own threat intelligence that we can provide to companies. And basically, that threat intelligence will give you a list of all known bad domains based on their reputation, right? So we know that these destinations are bad. So any DNS lookups that is coming in from within the network to those destinations, we can detect and block it at the DNS level. So whenever malware gets into the network and tries to call home, if it's going to a known bad site that we know is bad, we can drop that connection. And then behavior-based detection is for the sophisticated data exfiltration techniques I talked about, where attackers are using zero-day methods. So what we can do is we can look at the queries in real time as they're going out and look for presence of data in the DNS queries themselves. And we do this using sophisticated algorithms, using behavioral modeling. And we can tell you if there's any data exfiltration that's happening over the DNS queries. So 3 different approaches for slightly different problems, but they all focus around securing your enterprise using the DNS. Any questions so far? We're about halfway through the presentation. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this. We talked about it. So for detecting DNS tunneling, we have 12 different set of rule signatures that look at all the traffic that is going in or coming out, and we can tell you if it's part of a DNS tunneling. We can immediately block those queries and report on them as well. And the good thing about the threat intelligence for our DNS technologies is they're automatically updated frequently. Even if it's automatically updated for new destinations, new malicious destinations, any new threats that we find out about in the wild, we have it in our threat intelligence feed. So the protection stays up to date on an ongoing basis without having to reboot, restart, or patch, or any of those things. So this is the malware. I'm just going to skip this one. And then the behavioral analytics, I talked about the model we use for detecting data exfiltration. So we use certain things in information theory, things like entropy, lexical analysis, frequency, how many times the queries are going to the same destination, how often it's going, what are the size of the queries going out. So all of these can help us decide if there's data in the queries that are going up, right? So we look at some of those things in the bullets there, TXT records and all of that. It's kind of a little bit technical, but what we do is as we look at the data, or as we look at the DNS queries, we add a score. Every time certain attributes add to the score, certain attributes subtract from the score. And if at the end the algorithm determines that this could be a potential data exfiltration, we start blocking at that point onwards. So I want to spend kind of the next 5 to 7 minutes talking about network data and its relevance to security, right? So DHCP is the process of assigning an IP address whenever a new device comes onto the network, right? And it does it automatically. And what happens is when you do a DHCP assignment, you know exactly what type of device it is. Is it a Mac? Is it a PC? Is it a smartphone, a tablet, whatnot, right? And it keeps an audit trail of all the devices on the network. So that's a lot of information for you to use when you want to find out what devices are getting on the network. Are they assigned a proper IP address? Are they rogue devices? Are they devices that are not allowed onto your network? Things like that, right? So you can do a lot of things with just by looking at the DHCP assignments. IPAM, or IP address management. So typically, high-value assets in your network are assigned static or fixed IPs. And if you see that a malicious communication is happening from one of those high-value assets that have a static IP, you know that that's a higher priority, and you need to clean that device up first, right? So prioritizing threats, for that, IPAM comes into, IPAM is very useful because it'll tell you what type, if it's a high-value asset, if it's infected, you need to go and clean that up. And as I mentioned earlier, any bad query or good, right? Anything, any communication happens through DNS first. Excuse me. So, so having the DNS-based visibility is really important, and it actually can help you speed up your recovery process and your mitigation. So when you look at Infoblox as a control plane, because of where we sit in the network, most companies, most agencies have multiple DNS servers deployed inside their network. We're very close to the endpoints, and we see a lot of this data. We see a lot of DHCP data, IPAM data, DNS data going through the servers. And what we can do is we can give you a lot of contextual information, where the devices are located in the network, whether they're infected. We can also send the information to your typical security technologies that most companies have, right? Most companies have endpoint agents running on the laptops. Most companies have, maybe vulnerability scanners. They might have, sandboxing technologies, things like that, Cisco ISE or NAC. So we have integrations built into the whole different security ecosystem players. So we can give you a lot of information around the network. So you're actually making your security investments much better. You're enriching the SIM with information from Infoblox, right? You can do all of that and get a lot more contextual information about these threats that are inside your network. So that's kind of how we see DNS and the DNS security playing a role in the security ecosystem. So I talked about some of these. We have integrations with sandboxing technologies like FireEye. We have integrations with SIM through APIs and through other CSV formats. We have integrations with Cisco ISE for the NAC network access control. We have integration built in for Carbon Black, which is an endpoint security agent. And so basically, Infoblox sits in this middle, and we can provide all this information, indicators of compromise. If there's a laptop that's trying to connect to a bad domain, we can tell everybody that this is happening, right? So it accelerates remediation when you think about that. One of the programs we have running is something called a PCAP Analysis. So this is, if you give us like 20 minutes of your DNS trace, we can actually look at that and analyze it, and Ryan can give you a really nice report that will show you if there are any malware inside the network based on the traffic that we've analyzed, right? So, even if you just give us like 20 minutes, we can run it through our labs and tell you. And this was an example of a recent one we did. It's a county in California. There are some pretty significant malware that we found, including the popular Angler and Zeus malware. We also detected traces of DNS tunneling and phishing activity. So this is very simple, easy way to find out if you have malware inside your network. It's pretty straightforward, and most cases we usually find something or the other. I think we've done a lot of these in the recent past, and it's a pretty popular program. Did you want to add to that, Ryan?
Yeah, if anybody wants to do this, I've done about 100 of them for different government agencies, and it gives you at least a snapshot of visibility into what's actually traversing your existing infrastructure.
Yeah. So really some key takeaways, I talked about closing the back door to your sensitive data. So DNS is that back door. So if you haven't already thought about securing your DNS, I think it's the time. Now is the time to start thinking about it, because attackers are, know that this is a loophole in most agencies and most companies, and they are exploiting it. DNS and DDI data, DDI stands for DNS, DHCP, and IPAM, actually plays a significant role in your security architecture. It gives you a lot of network context. It gives you a lot of information about where the infections are happening in your network. So really taking advantage of all that data is a win-win for both security and for networking teams. And as I mentioned, raising the awareness of DNS vulnerabilities in your organization is something we always advocate, and it's a gap. And if you want to learn more, feel free to stop by our booth, 214, or talk to Ryan. He can do the PCAP security assessment for you. I'll also be here for a little while if you have more questions, but I can take some questions now.
So the Infoblox, from my understanding, we get it straight. Infoblox actually monitors the network traffic and tracks the IPs and malware.
Yeah, it monitors DNS traffic. Yeah. So we actually Infoblox offers DNS servers, so we are a DNS appliance company. And because we serve up the protocol, we also track all the DNS traffic going in and out, and we have a lot of data around that. Yes?
How do you measure how accurate your algorithms are that sort of quantify
Yeah.
whether something is dangerous?
Data exfiltration. That's a great question. So one of the things we've done when we built the algorithm is obviously run it through our labs and run it through some customer environments to fine-tune the algorithms, using the typical machine learning techniques and things like that. So as the algorithms keep running in our labs, they become more accurate. They become more efficient and come up with less false positives. So we've trained those algorithms quite well over the last year or so in our labs, as well as in some customer environments. But even after that, if you do see some false positives, we can always add a whitelist to it. So if you don't want to block something to a certain destination, we can have a whitelist that then will allow traffic to those destinations. But there's been significant, I think, research done in the behavioral modeling of the algorithm that over the last year. So we're fairly confident in its efficacy. Yeah.
Can you help an entity after it's been hit with ransomware?
So so that's a very good question. So when you think about the malware kill chain, right? Once it enters or breaches the perimeter, and once it's locked up your data, if it's ransomware we're talking about, if it's already locked up your data, then it's kind of a bit too late, right? So what it does is ransomware, once it gets into the network, it'll make the DNS connection and then download the software, the malicious software that'll lock up the data. So if you catch it before it downloads the software, then your data doesn't get locked up, and you preempt that. So when it makes that first DNS connection, we can detect and block it. So before it actually locks up your data, if you have the Infoblox DNS firewall product in there. Yeah. Any other questions for me or Ryan?
So one of the examples of that is like if you went to a website, lodinet.com, that will lock up your browser, and that's one of the things that we prevent, and then it gets automatically updated in our interface every 30 minutes. But it's not necessarily just a website, right? These things traverse through unknown methods, and they're not just, your user may have no idea that it's actually going on their endpoint device. And as far as the mathematical logarithm, we've run that for so long, we actually provide a whitelist in the inside because other security vendors know that your firewall can't block DNS. So they're actually doing their product updates through DNS. So they make a call home attempt through the firewall, and they actually bring down their signatures, their product updates. So in the inside of our interface, they'll say, well, do you have Sophos in your environment? Okay, yes. So check that box, allow that through. Do you have McAfee DLP solution in your environment? Because that does product updates as well through it. Check that box, yes. You can remove the other ones. But typically the most fun I have when I go in is you can actually go in and you can tell immediately every single user and every single device that's using Spotify on your network. It's almost universally people are listening to Spotify. And so music is streamed this way, back and forth across these DNS tunnel queries. And then if you go up and look up Spotify distributed unknown malware in one of their 2011 product updates. And so now you automatically have it inside of your environment. So this is just one of the very unique holes that we actually plug.
I think I missed how exactly
Yeah, did you want to say?
It really depends on your environment. Do you have laptops coming and going off of your network? Yes. Okay, so there's ransomware that's so intelligent today that it will wait until it will encrypt and extract information inside of your network, health records, your Facebook logins. You just logged into your bank account at Bank of America or Wells Fargo, and it'll catch that. And then it'll say, hey, you know what? I don't want to go through firewalls. I don't want to go through DLP solutions and Sophos and all web proxies and all this. I'm going to wait until that laptop leaves my network and goes to a Starbucks or goes home to some type of wireless address that your AT&T or your Comcast provider provides you, and then it will start executing and sending the data out.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for listening, and hope you found it useful.